if it charges. Hi everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Meline. If you don't know me or know Aidóni, I'm Aidóni's founder. Aidóni is an organization that connects journalists and agents of change on the ground for people who work within conflict-related topics. We try to foster conversation to create a safe space for those two groups to exchange and hopefully have a more constructive and inclusive covering of those conflicts thanks to those conversations. I'm really thrilled to be joined by Sadia and Shreya today, who are my guests. Sadia is the founder of Language Matters, which is a diversity and inclusion consultancy that educates individuals and organizations on diversity, bias, inclusion, and equity, as well as an Instagram account that also does a quite wonderful jobs educating people by providing inclusive language education by discussing problematic words and how to go through a more inclusive language. She will get more into details really soon. And we also have Shreya. Shreya is Aidóni's podcast editor. Thanks to her, really soon we will launch our very first podcast. So maybe what I'll do is I'll let her introduce herself and tell her a bit more about this podcast that is coming out next week.
Hi everyone, I am Shreya. I am the podcast editor at Aidóni, as Meline mentioned, and I am actually working on a podcast that's gonna be out soon, which is on language and how it operates and how it sort of curates a person's sensibilities, relating it to journalism, because we all know how, like, we hear this term a lot, that when journalists write something, they say something, it's very important. It's something that it's our words have a lot of power, and especially in the current socio-political situation that we are in, our words do have a lot of power, and we must remember it. And how does language play into it? How language, in terms of where you are, where you're situated, where in which part of the world you're working in, that has so much of impact on what how you report, how you present a journalistic piece, all of that. So everything about language and journalism, we are covering different parts of the world, and through the course of 4 episodes that we'll be bringing to you. And I'm really excited. We've been working on it for a while, and I'm really excited that we are going to bring it out to you soon. I hope it helps you sort of understand. Our whole point is to sort of understand media, understand journalism, understand language away from English and away from the West. Saying, like, it's ironic that I'm saying this while speaking in English, but I think that's sort of become like a in ways where you might not like it, but it's become a status quo. It has become the language, but the whole point is to understand it from beyond the West, beyond the English language. So that's all that our podcast is about, and I hope that you guys like it. And I will over to Sadia. I think and I'm so happy that we have her to have this conversation, because no one better than her for today to have this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really honoured to be joining you. As Meline said, I am the founder of Language Matters, and Language Matters exists to help individuals and organisations foster more inclusive language. And would it be helpful, Meline, for me to tell you a little bit about how Language Matters came about?
I would love that. I was about to ask you about that.
So Language Matters exists in 2 guises. I work with organisations to help them foster more inclusive language, but first and foremost, it started as an Instagram account. So my background is communications, and very specifically advertising and marketing. And I've had the privilege of working in that industry for 2.5 decades. I've always loved language. I've always loved books. I've always loved just the power of language in terms of connotation, context, inflection, emphasis, etc. And when I went into advertising, it was a very middle class profession, very different people to perhaps the ones that I might have grown up with. And I always found a slight tension in terms of the way that we would, it's not a diverse industry, the way in which we would refer to and talk to about each other's identities. And then the actual catalyst for starting Language Matters as an Instagram account was the murder of George Floyd and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. Clearly, that was a very traumatic time for our Black friends and colleagues, and Language Matters was my contribution to that narrative. And what I do on the Instagram account is I take a word, a phrase, an idiom, something that's been discussed in our culture, and I break down why it is problematic, and if it's appropriate, I provide other words that people can use instead, to just use more inclusive, progressive language that basically ensures that everyone feels seen, validated, and have a greater sense of belonging. So it's very much a labour of love.
And how did it go? Like, what was the process of really starting? Like, one day you were at home and really frustrated and just starting doing some research and talking, like, yeah.
Really, so essentially, yeah, it was so at that time we were kind of in semi-lockdown, and I know that there are people that are joining us and who will be listening to this who are based all around the world, but at that time, at the end of May, the beginning of June, we were kind of semi in lockdown, and people were marching, and the UK was still in lockdown. My parents are elderly. I couldn't risk going to marches, but I was seeing all of this rhetoric, on one side very sort of pro Black Lives Matter and the importance of understanding police brutality and specifically anti-Blackness, but then I was also seeing people say things like it was his fault, it was bad, it's all of these kind of very reductive, inappropriate, frankly racist commentary. And I started breaking down what people were saying to basically look at what those statements were predicated on. And over time, and it's probably worth me talking about my methodology, the way that I sort of approach posts, it's either based on my lived experience, the lived experience of somebody else, or just discourse that's going on in society that I want to analyse. And so I always ensure that, and I hope this is interesting for people, I always ensure that whenever I talk about something, that I have a number of 5 independent sources, so that I'm not, I've writing something and someone had written underneath it, that's a bit of a reach. No one says that. And I was able to go back and say, well, actually, there are all of these etymologists, these linguists, and people that are saying this, as well as people with lived experience. So that's the way that I approach it. So it was a little bit of being in captivity, and mostly just the fact that I think that for all of the reasons that you have outlined, and the reason that Aidóni exists, our language is incredibly important. It is neutral, it's coded and it's loaded, and it's a manifestation of our beliefs, and it creates a reality rather than describing a reality. And so that's really what fuels Language Matters, and why I think it's so important, and what gets me up every day and working on it.
Could you develop a bit on how it's language that shapes reality and not reality that shapes language? Because most people could think the relationship is the other way around.
Yeah. So when I say that language shapes reality rather than the other way around, it's because it's no one is a blank canvas. Language, we sometimes view language as neutral, that we just take words off the shelf and we construct a sentence to say what we mean. But really, our choice of words are predicated on bias, previous experience, preconceived notions, just our view of the world, etc. So I often talk about, when I go to organisations and talk about the fact that your language actually betrays you quite a lot. It will tell you the way that you ask questions or pass commentary on something basically is predicated on your beliefs. So to give you an example, and this is my example, it's an example that comes from bell hooks, but it's one that I rely on quite a lot. So something that has been said to me in the past. I'm born and brought up in the UK. I have a very British accent, and I will sometimes hear people, prior to starting Language Matters in advertising agencies, who would comment on the fact that I was articulate, or that I had expressed myself well. And sometimes the sting end of that statement would be, "You don't sound Asian." And my Black colleagues and friends would hear the statement, "You don't sound Black." So to analyse that shaping, the way that language shapes a reality rather than being neutral, is you have someone that has come across somebody else, they've enjoyed their company, they've enjoyed what they have to say, they've valued what they have to say, and then they make a statement like, "You don't sound like, you're very articulate for a Black person or an Asian person." And what you're seeing there is they have a preconceived notion that this is how certain people of colour should sound. They've been given a new data set, but yet rather than reassess how they feel, they double down on their viewpoint. And so that's just one example, but that's often what happens when it comes to identity. So saying to someone that, "Oh, I would never have known that you were gay." And what happens when you make a statement like that, and when you have an identity that might be other, that might be marginalized, might be minoritized, is it leaves you as that individual being dumped with someone's preconceived notions, and you having to deal with it in terms of the way that you might present yourself, or the fact that you might bring down certain aspects of your culture or your identity. So it's just, that's what I mean about language shaping reality rather than being based on fact and what is out there.
All right, interesting. So what do you observe regarding journalism? Because journalism is all about words and how we describe the words that we report on. We tend to say that we're, as journalists, neutral and objective, which is something that we tend to question a little bit at Aidóni, if it's even possible. I like that I see Shreya's face, and she says yes. But so how do you think, and we're going to get more into details later, but like in general, when you watch the news, how do you feel? Do you feel that journalists are doing a good job at using, like, consciously choose their words?
Yes and no. I'm going to pull out a tiny bit on that question. So whenever, the moment that someone says something, as I've said, shaping the world and reality for someone else, we are very prone to influence. We have whole industries such as influencers. We like endorsements. We like people's views. And that's magnified tenfold when it comes to journalism. Journalists are responsible for providing a frame of reference in which individuals will then interpret a reality. So you're held to a higher standard than I will be if I were an influencer, a creator, someone in advertising. And so words really matter. And for me, I think that if you are telling a story of a place, a community, an incident, something that has happened that you do not have real base level understanding of, then you're going to bring your bias to that. And so what I call for, and I'm very keen to point out that my background is obviously not journalism. I did do a 2-week work experience with 60 East London advertiser, but I don't think that counts here. But I do really call for diversity in newsrooms. And I know that this is something that you advocate for at Aidóni, in terms of often you will find, and we're finding that in terms of the situation that is the dire situation that's unfolding at the moment in Israel and the Gaza Strip, you will parachute journalists in because that's where the world's attention is. We must have people on the ground or nearby in the region. But I always think that if you're not working with journalists who are there day in, day out, there's going to be a lens that's going to be applied that may not reflect reality, or will at the very least be biased. So I think that there's a responsibility, and the reason why I've said yes and no is because I'm going to put someone like Fox TV and Talk TV, as we have in the UK, to one side, because they are populist, they have an agenda. If we look at someone like the BBC, which I know is, I speak as someone that's based in the UK, but they are an entity that's known throughout the world, they will do things such as the right to reply, showing both, ensuring that both sides are present and giving people the right to respond, so that things are balanced. They are meant to uphold impartiality, but the reason why I said yes and no is, even though all of those practices are in place, the way to ask questions to those parties may differ, and that's where we have to be incredibly careful, and that's where we see the bias seep through, and I think that we're definitely seeing that right now.
Yeah, exactly. I'd like to ask Shreya about her perspective on this, because you've already recorded a few episodes of the podcast that is coming out next week. And you talked to journalists based in South Asia and Latin America, right? About this, about like the maybe Western scope on media and how you treat that. Can you tell us a bit about what you talked about and what you maybe found interesting or unexpected, I don't know, in your conversation with them?
Sure. So I think it's a very interesting thing that Sadia mentioned, that how having no knowledge of a place and just, sort of jumping into the news because it's happening and everybody needs to be there. I think there are a lot of these journalists right now in Israel and Gaza, covering the whole thing, but they have no knowledge of the region, of the politics, of the socio-political historic situation, if you were to ask them, like how this came into being. And I think that's something that is very intrinsic to where our podcast, it's called What's the Word. So the whole point of this is, what's the word, what's the that how language sort of matters when you're talking about something. So it's very intrinsic to the whole idea of the podcast, because what we constantly were trying to sort of bring out in this podcast while I was talking to different people was that how it is important for us, for journalists, especially if you're a journalist based in Latin America. And when I say Latin America, I mean it as a whole, but also different parts of Latin America has different socio-cultural, political, historical aspects that come into play. So a journalist from Brazil will be more accustomed, will be able to report better on Brazil than if I were to travel to Brazil today and become a correspondent, a foreign correspondent there, and trying to report on the issues there. Because I can study, I can talk to people, and I can learn about it, but I do not have the lived experiences. I do not have the knowledge as well as the journalist who's lived there, who's been working there, whose work encompasses that region has. So that is something that we've talked about a lot throughout the podcast, because this was one thing that we were dealing with. And we were talking how, big media houses have their foreign offices across different parts of the world, and they will send a foreign correspondent who will most likely be someone from their home country and not from the country that the correspondent is in. For example, if I were to give example of where I am based in India, a lot of foreign correspondents are people coming from the UK or the US who are currently based in India and covering India, which is very I don't know, I think it sort of defeats the purpose, because you're talking about a region where you do not sort of, I'm not saying that you cannot learn about it, but to have someone who's had that experience to talk about it sort of gives more weightage to your journalism, to your work. So it's very important to sort of be responsible enough to give to understand that representation matters. You cannot just take it for granted. You cannot just say like, okay, today I will just go to Israel and I will start covering the conflict without having zero knowledge or zero understanding of how conflict, and especially when it is conflict zones, it becomes even more important when we are covering conflict, because not just the fact that you have to have the prior understanding, but also that you need to understand how conflict journalism works, how how sensitive you have to be, what you must report and what you mustn't, what sort of language you have to use, because what you're saying, like we saw what happened, there's so much of disinformation, so much of fake news that's being propagated, because people are just not aware of how to go about it, are not talking to the right people. So that's what my thought is. And when I was talking to people for the podcast, for when we were recording, this was one thing that sort of kept this whole thing, that we need to identify, we need to understand not just ourselves as journalists, away from the whole Western idea of what journalism encompasses, which also sort of involves giving a lot of importance to local newsrooms, to newsrooms in your own country, to regional language news media, because they a huge chunk of population is tuning into that. So there's a sort of, like, English is not a language that is spoken in most parts of the world. So there's local media does have a lot of impact, how they cover, how they sort of bring out the news, how they talk about an issue has a huge impact on how that issue is sort of viewed in that region, in that part of the world. So it's very important to sort of work together with them and sort of understand, like Sadia mentioned, that language matters, and language, not just one language, every language, what we're saying, what we speak, to develop, to create, to have that conversation, to create that awareness, to create that vocabulary that is missing, is very important. So that was like, oh, I think one of the crux that has come out of the podcast so far, and what has gone behind the idea of the podcast.
Thank you. Very interesting. And like, just to head back, but what you were saying, it's also that when you send journalists that don't really know the region or don't like master the local language, like what kind of information do you get? Because does like the person that is really affected by conflict or whatever other situation speaks English, like if the translator only can speak the local language and English to then talk to, let's say I'm French, so like the French journalist in English, which is the only language they have in common, then like you only talk to the part of the population that speaks English, which is
Exactly, and which
far.
is very less, yeah.
Exactly, in many countries, in many regions, it's very often going to be only the privileged, the elite part of society. And I mean, not saying that what they have to say matters, doesn't matter, but like it's not the only thing that matters. And if we want to be accurate, um, you have to work on this. And it's also really true that I've heard many of my friends were usually non-European, North American, non-white journalists, well, something were happening in their countries or regarding their own community, they're like, you can't report on it because you cannot be neutral. But it's okay for me as a French woman to report on France, on Europe, and on almost anywhere. I mean, it's okay. It's said to be okay for me to report on anywhere because white European, North American is apparently neutral. But for like people that are not all of the above, if they report on their community, they cannot be neutral.
Yeah.
When they're the one, right? When they're the one who might have access to all the stories, who speak the language, and as you say, like if languages are so diverse and so complex, and which I think is the most beautiful thing, because when you learn a new language, you learn a new way of seeing and understanding the world you live in. So it means they also have words that you won't have in another language because we have different realities. We have different needs in describing the realities in different culture, and you're lacking so much if you don't have those people on the ground who understand all the nuances and all the diversity. And sometimes we're missing a word, but like they're going to give us the phrase, like the sentence that will perfectly describe these words, which like me, even if I learned, I will probably never be able to describe it as perfectly. But yeah, very interesting topic. So in we talked about conflict and how important it is it's always important, but especially in the situation, conflict. When I say conflict, I mean social or armed conflicts. With unfortunately, it's happening all around, all the time, everywhere. So that's why I think it's very important for us to tackle this topic here between us, but also in general, it's our responsibility to really be aware of the impact of the reporting we do, and how words that we use to describe an event, talk about a community, or explain history facts to kind of tell what led to the current situation is going to have a huge impact on how people perceive
Yeah.
um, the event, how they understand it, and then like, will they go in the street and protest for it? Will they start like some pressure on their elites, on the politicians, and like, will it influence in the end political decisions and then decision on the ground? Like, it's a whole kind of circle. So I was wondering, what would be a good way to just make sure that you use the right words? What kind of resources could you look for? I don't know, just if someone came to you and said, I want to talk about this topic, how do I make sure that I use the right words? If there is something such as being sure of using the right word.
Really good question, and a really big question. I think that the area that I would probably focus on is the way that we ask questions, because that is often where bias most rears its head the most. Because the way that you ask a question is based on, so you can ask somebody, so moving away from the idea of conflict to just asking someone where they're from, know where they're really from, is the bias there is predicated on believing that someone doesn't belong in a European nation if they look like me, for example. So I will get that question quite a lot. So I think that one of the things that, yeah, as journalists should do is that when they are asking a question, it has to be a real question rather than a projection. And that is something that journalists need to ask themselves day in, day out when they are on the ground. And we should all be doing that as co-workers, irrespective of what industry we work in. Then in terms of just resources, I think it is, like, again, not coming from a journalistic background, I think that this is all about research and ensuring that you are really getting under the skin of the matter, talking to diverse voices, talking to local voices, ensuring that you're, there will always be news outlets that are about having a hot take, but if you are not from one of those stations, newspapers, etc., you need to practice impartiality, and so therefore you need to have the tools to practice that impartiality, and that comes from data, knowledge, insight, and understanding, and you need to really cast your net wide to ensure that you have all of that. Obviously, when situations are fast moving, that becomes incredibly difficult. But the argument that I have is that when things are fast moving and evolving as they are right now, emotions are really high, sensitivities are really high. We're talking about humanity here. And that is what should shine out always. And so you have even more of a responsibility to ensure that you are reporting with respect, reporting with neutrality, reporting with knowledge and understanding. Because if you don't have any of those things, you should not be there. You're just the man or woman or person on that should be back on their sofa passing commentary. You should not have the privilege of basically helping people make sense of the world, because that's essentially what journalists are doing.
Very much so. And you, Shreya, so you're a journalist and you've been writing stories and a little bit. So how do you deal with that to like make sure to pick the right word? You're in mute. I don't know if I can unmute you.
I am so sorry.
No worries.
No, I think like the first thing you have to understand is that when you're reporting, when you're writing about something, it has to be inclusive. Your language has to be inclusive. It not just in terms of in terms of, okay, if you're writing about gender, you write gender neutral. Language should be gender neutral, and so on and so forth. But just in general, I think what happens, like Sadia mentioned, that because there's such a hype for sensitive topics, that if you write something, what do you call it, something that's flashy, something, a headline that will get you the most clicks, or the most views, or so on and so forth. There's this preference to go towards that, because like, I don't know, this, I feel like, as journal, like, with the whole what do you call it, the competitive environment that journalists are now operating it in globally, I think this whole thing that we need to get more views on this piece, or we need to get more likes on this piece, sort of makes us forget that we are talking about people. We are it's not like, okay, Israel dropped so many bombs on Gaza, on Gazans, or so many people in Gaza, so many Palestinian kids died. You have to understand, when you're writing that you're talking about human life, you're talking about lives lost, which is something that cannot be something that you're doing for views, or like, for example, I'll just want to sort of give this example. There's this one of the biggest media houses in India, actually, and they have sort of this notification that comes on my phone. It says uh, the Gaza Dispatch, and which is about how many people are being killed, or what's happening in Gaza. And I'm like, that's not the language you use for a place that is being that is facing literally a wipeout, genocide of immense proportion. But that's how, they've made it like a newsletter, how, just click on it and you'll know what is happening, sitting right in the comfort of your home. So I think something as simple as that makes you realize that it's, I don't know, I feel like people have forgotten that they're talking about people, they're talking about human lives, they're talking about something that sort of gives information to people, thinking people like you and me and a lot of others. They're looking at it some as sort of a job, in terms of, yeah, I just need to get these many stories out, or I need to get these many writings out. And that's where language sort of gets defeated, the whole purpose of language. I think nobody's thinking of it in terms of inclusivity. We are doing that, we are trying to have those conversations because we are seeing what is wrong. But I think when we talk about mainstream media, which is like what most people are consuming on a day-to-day basis, they're not. That's like not their concern. Like, that's sort of like the last thing they want to talk about is inclusivity, and how, and that's not being taught in journalism schools. That's not being taught in sort of classes which have become more how to deal and how to work in a practical journalistic newsroom setting, but not going into the depth of how what you write and what the impact it can have. So I think the problem starts there. But as a journalist, I think how you can navigate is sort of, you have to constantly keep unlearning stuff. You cannot hold these rigid beliefs like, okay, I think this is right, so this is right, or I read this there, so a BBC is right, or an Al Jazeera is right, but a smaller news outlet might not have, might not, I will not pay that much attention to it. No, it cannot be like that. You have to look at it like, you have to read more, you have to learn more, but you also have to unlearn more. None of us, I'm sure, we were taught, or we were not born with the sort of language that we speak today. While growing up, I'm sure we were not speaking the same language that we are speaking today. We have unlearned and learned things as we go and as we talk to more people, and another thing is talking to more people and understanding their perspective. I think that's very important when you're talking about inclusivity. And again, like going back to what Sadia mentioned, that you cannot just talk to one group of people, or like one bunch of people and construct your news. You have to talk to different people to understand how that impacts. So like how something might impact me might not be the same as how that might impact you. So talking to more people and unlearning and being open to understanding that you're not always right. You just because you have that you're a journalist and you have that sort of you have that power to sort of report on an issue, doesn't mean that you know the best. There are people who know better, and you need to give them the mic. Sometimes you need to sort of let them tell their stories rather than you trying to construct a story out of what they told you. So I think that's one way to sort of navigate the whole inclusive language, like try to be more inclusive in terms of language.
And may I add to that excellent response from Shreya to that question, as well as inclusivity and unlearning, I would also add empathy. I think that just being human beings, the way that we build social connection is through asking questions, being curious, etc. And the world as we grow up, and just the way that the world has, formed itself as we reside in it today, means that we can have empathy for some people and not empathy for others, because that's what society tells us through our news, through entertainment, through commentary, through our government's policies. And I wanted to provide a couple of examples to qualify that. So or if you allow me to use two examples. So one is the tsunami that took place in the Indian Ocean, many years ago, and horrible natural disaster, catastrophic. And I remember being somebody that's brown, South Asian, there have been other tragedies that have taken place throughout the world in that region that have not had the amount of eyeballs that had. And I remember sort of thinking to myself, oh, isn't it great that a light is being shone on that area of the world at this time? That's so important. And a friend of mine said, but you know why that is, though, don't you? It's not the area, it's who's involved in that area. And it was and he then went on to say that, if it bleeds, and as the adage goes, if it bleeds, it leads. And the thing that I would add to that, and if they're white and European, then it goes straight to the top. And another example of that, and like I say that with empathy, that is the right thing to do. It is the right thing to shine the light there. But then you have, and rather than but, you have situations like, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, unlawful on so many levels. We're still living through that and feeling geopolitical implications of that ongoing struggle. A lot of the journalists that, again, who were parachuted into the region when the war broke out, would talk about, and especially American journalists, they would talk about, God, they're just like us. They were just having coffee and tea, and then this happened, and you can see where things have been abandoned, and they've just run away because they had to. And it's, again, that is an accurate description, but we don't use that sort of language to describe other parts of the world. It is a view that, that's just what happens to people that look like me, that live in another part of the world. These instances happen to them. They don't happen to people like us. And that means that you're taught who to have empathy for and not to have empathy for. And one of the examples specifically to talk about the ongoing situation in Israel and the Gaza Strip, the Gaza envelope, is that there's been one example that has been talked about quite a lot. It's a headline that said more than 1,000 Israelis have been killed, and several hundred at the time Palestinians died. And I know from my background in communications that you don't want to repeat a word. You kind of need a word to be, a sentence to be constructed kind of in a way that looks nice, that is kind of makes sense. But in that, killed is an active word. It's something has happened, and they were killed. They were unlawfully killed. Died is a state of being. they were also killed. And so through the construction of that, no context is given for their death. It creates a narrative for certain lives being more important than others. And this is why Shriya's point about humanity and remembering that you're a human at the end of the day is what has to shine through this. And unfortunately, through those word choices and the way that we have a lack of empathy, that sets up a construct for people that are consuming that media, mostly mainstream, and that is just a cycle that perpetuates. And we're living through that now, and it's just incredibly demoralizing that one life would be deemed more important than another life. And it's just not the state of not where we should be.
Very good point. I'm just going to say for people watching that in about 10 minutes, we're going to open the Q&A session. So if you already want to start thinking of something you want to ask, more details, or if you have a specific case that you would like to talk us about, feel free to start putting in the comments. But just going back on what you were saying, which is about the humanity and the be aware of why we cover things in a specific way and with more or less attention. And it's always this. I teach also journalism in some schools and journalism schools, and how they forget that it's about humans. And I'm like, journalism is all about humans talking about humans to humans. Like it's everywhere. It's all about this. So having this as a given, it is going like neutrality is not a thing. Like we have different experience, different understanding of what's happening and all of it. What we say has a huge impact on lives, actual lives, even if we don't know them, even if those people don't look just like you. Like this should not. I was, I mean, with many people, like just horrified hearing, like, yeah, but they look just like us, like they're not like those people that from before. Like, why does it matter that they're blonde? Like it shouldn't. And I think this is something that we've seen very recently with the situation with Azerbaijan and Armenia, only a few weeks before Israel Palestine, where for people who didn't follow, Azerbaijan and Armenia has been, let's say, a difficult to say the less relationship between those two countries to fight for a region that's Gaba. And Azerbaijan has been doing like a blockus, so really blocking food and medicine and any kind of supply to get into that specific regions. And after 8 months of doing this, they attacked, and of course the population was like, you didn't eat for 8 months or like barely, and you didn't have like no medicine or nothing. So the population was weak to say the least, and of course could not resist. So that this led to like tens of thousands of people. I don't have the exact number, but I want to say 150,000, um, and had to leave the country and go to Armenia and other places. And nobody reported on it, or very, very little. And
Yeah.
I was in Armenia for personal reasons not so long ago, which is a reason that I didn't know before. It's a region that I didn't know before going there. And then the people I made contact with when I was there, just publishing and trying to get the attention. And almost no one was publishing about it. And a few weeks later, happened like the situation in Israel and Palestine that we know starts. Not saying that one is more important than the other, and I mean we've established this in this conversation that is not what it is about,
Yeah.
but just a difference of coverage.
Mhm.
Because it's always like more complex, or like the relationship with Israel for European and North American is like a very
Yeah.
tricky one. There's a lot of history and power and relationships in place there. But yeah, like, so what's the difference between those two regions? We're in something similar. It's a long story. There have
Yeah.
been several wars.
Mhm.
It's about like taking control of a territory, and it's something that can be described as genocide. But it did not get the same attention because it's further, it's like Caucasus is this tiny region in the middle of
Mhm.
many things, and we never hear about it. But so it was interesting, and kind of forgetting that they're humans and those hundreds and thousands of people that left, which also leaves me. So like we try, to use the right words. There's also a thing like getting attention. Using specific words is going to get more attention than using others, and more views of this. But what if you use one word and then you realize it wasn't a good one? So when you've made a mistake in the word you chose, whether because you wanted to get the attention and you didn't think, like forward of the impact of having this, and maybe having likes doesn't matter as much has the impact that the word that you chose is going to have on the narrative, on the stereotypes, on the understanding of the event, or whether because you were misinformed and realized that it was not. So how can you deal with this and fix it if it's at all possible?
From my perspective, really good question. I think that there's clearly these things operate on a scale. There are the extreme. If you have been highly inflammatory, calling for deaths, etc., that should be dealt with separately. And clearly, I would hope that more journalists are on the area that is much more nuanced, and something might have happened because they're clumsy with their words. First and foremost, in my opinion, I would say that people should always be able to come back from a mistake, and we should allow them to have the grace to come back from that mistake. And that would mean apologizing, explaining what has happened. Because otherwise, how are we going to unlearn? How are we going to get better if we just shut people down and that they make one mistake and they're gone? That kind of should not be it should not happen on an interpersonal level. It should not happen in the offices that we work in. It should not happen in our news. So should be able to come back. I think that also alongside of that, consumers of that media should be able to challenge things that they hear and see, and journalists should always I think most mainstream media, most established media houses, irrespective of size, will have bodies that they are responsible for, such as Ofcom in the UK that we have, so that there is a party, a separate independent party that is monitoring some kind of transgression that might have taken place, because you cannot, as we would say in the UK, mark your own homework, because you're simply not going to be able to do that with a degree of neutrality. So I think my very long-winded but short answer ultimately is you should be able to come back from that by explaining why you've made the mistake and what you have learned, and an apology should be issued, because as we've said, especially with armed conflict, these words have impact. We've already seen a rise in anti-Semitic hate crimes, specifically in the UK. We've seen a rise in Islamophobia, a murder of a 6-year-old boy in Chicago in the US. This is happening because of the narratives and the way that we're talking about things. So I've kind of circled that question, but the short answer is you should be able to apologize, learn, and move on.
It's like creating like a safe space where it's okay to say like a mistake was made, and no, it's fine. And well, actually, I think if Shreya, did you want to add anything? If not, I'm going to dive into the question, because we have one that is kind of related to this. Up in UC, yeah. So Anna is asking, do you think high school should teach language and media as a skill enhancement course to recognize the hidden agendas of the media?
Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah.
I say absolutely. That understanding how narratives are created and the power that they have, either through governments or journalists or political parties, all three of those, well, political parties and government, the kind of, how they talk about the journalism as being the fourth state, it is as important. So yes, we should be able to we should study that, and we should also what underpins that study is the ability to have critical thinking and critical thought. Because what happens when there is a pervading narrative is that we accept it because that's what we've been taught to do rather than question. And the extreme of that is conspiracy theories. And I'm not suggesting that where you question absolutely everything and everything, it kind of ladders up to a conspiracy theory. But I think that the core skills of being able to seek out multiple opinions, diversity of thought, applying critical thinking to what you are being exposed to is a fundamental life skill, and that should start young. So my short answer to that is I think that is really, really important.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think we also have to admit that over the course of so many years since we've been, the idea of media and what it encompasses has also changed, especially we're in 2023 now. Media is just not what we're watching or what we are reading anymore. It's every day, whatever we're scrolling through social media, Twitter, Twitter is not called Twitter anymore. It's X, Instagram, and everything. Like media encompasses all of that because we are consuming that. We're watching movies. We're listening to music. Music, what the lyrics of a song is also a sort of media that we are engaging with. So not just limiting yourself to media as in what you're watching on TV, as in TV news or reading in the newspaper, but everything that you're consuming on a day-to-day basis, which is now more, which has sort of become more, I'd say, something that we do more often than, say, watching TV. We are mostly on social media, and the language that is being used there to write and to talk about stuff is also something that we must understand and sort of try to be able to tell what is right and what is not, because we've seen, especially in the past few years, what misinformation, the amount of misinformation that the rise of social media has sort of brought about. Not saying that social media is all bad, but it's easy to sort of put the information out there without a lot of cross-checking now with the with the growth of social media. So for us, for young people to be able to, like, as journalists, we are trained, most of us are trained to sort of be able to tell what is right and what is not, what is fake and what is not, but not most of the others are. So as young people, if you're sort of taught that skill to understand language, and how it interacts with media, you'll not just be able to, you sort of recognize what is right and wrong, but also be able to pinpoint it to other people around you who might not be at this point be able to go back to school and sort of unlearn that. So I think doing it on a daily basis in your own homes with the people you interact with, that sort of matters, because how else are we going to do it otherwise?
Yeah. Couldn't agree more. And I mean, I don't know about in your different countries where you're based, but I don't know if in France you have some education to media kind of thing. Um, I mean, I'm not right off high school, but I'm 28, so high school was not such a long time ago, and I do not remember it. So it never happened, or it was such a short thing that I do not remember having this. And I know that in France, there's of course no money for this, so journalists will go and try to educate people, have to do it on their own free time. And journalism is already kind of a precarious situation. We're not making a lot of money out of it, so taking even more time, not working on stories and all of it. Not everyone can afford to do it, but and also like it means that it's not part of the program. It's something more that it is the responsibility of the schools to organize, which can be something difficult or like time consuming, and you don't do it. And I agree with everything that's been said, and Shreya saying that the conversation also needs to happen somewhere else, because our parents are not in high school, and maybe those are new topics that weren't as talked about as it is today. but also better trained journalists. Because I teach in French journalism schools, which are good schools. That's not a problem. But they know how to be journalists, but they don't study journalism as a social product, construct. They don't study the impact of journalism. They don't study like how the audience responses to specific reports, or how one specific reports can change a narrative and help shaping a narrative, which I think is something essential. I was very lucky because I did my studies abroad, and I had this part. And most of my masters was more about studying journalism as a thing than reporting, going outside with a camera and editing a podcast or whatever, which are important skills. But we spent a lot of time just talking about journalism. And how did we do it in different places? Because I was I was very lucky to be in a very international cohort where we had people from like over 40 countries, which is a very privileged position and place to study. But it was very interesting because in the same class we had people from India, Nicaragua, Nigeria, Germany, and many more. But so we could have those conversations. But how do you do it differently in your country? What has been the impact of doing something different? And also just studying like what are the answers? What do the audience want? So I think we also need, as journalists, that are already in practice, but also when we train the journalists, because then we save so much time. That train the future journalists, the journalists to be directly to like think about that, read not only the product, don't only read the news, but also read about journalism, the research, the surveys. Talk with your audience. How did they feel when you use that word to talk about something else or to talk about their own community? Because you have many studies that show you that marginalized community don't trust the news because the way the news report on them. Of course, if the news report on you using words that are not okay to you to be described as, using words X or Y, or in a very stereotyped way, will you believe the news? Will you trust the news when they come to you for information? When they tell you that you should act like this or you should be aware of this if you feel misrepresented? And those are topics that are absolutely not talked about, at least in the universities that I see. Not saying that it's like this everywhere, but it should happen nowhere. Let's put it like this. All right. I don't know if we have another question. Not of now. If you do, you have a couple of minutes left. Was there anything, Shreya or Sadia, that we didn't talk about and that you think is worth mentioning? A specific case or anything else, or did we do a great job and covered everything, which is not possible?
I think from my perspective, the only thing that we didn't touch on very briefly is geographical bias and just the way that we class the world, where we'll talk about, and maybe this is less to do with journalism, more to do with interpersonal kind of communication, but the way that we will refer to the world, because journalists are responsible now, they don't use terms such as third world, but they used to, and that has seeped into culture, and people will still use those terms and will still use things like first world problems or talk about a place being quite third world. And so I think geographical bias is definitely a hot topic for me in journalism and something that I look out for, the way that we can kind of create a hierarchy into the way that we talk about society, and it just becomes really reductive, as if people within certain countries don't have the rounded lives that other people might live in other places because of that view of the world.
It's very interesting that Sadia mentions this. I think I've said this story to Meline a lot of times. We've spoken about this quite a few times, but I'll just share it because actually, the whole idea of me wanting to work with languages and how it interacts with media sort of came from a conversation about a geographical bias that like I was speaking to my friend, my best friend, and she's a sociology she's doing a PhD in sociology, and we were talking generally, and I was like, how, so I kept referring to India as the Indian subcontinent when we were talking about like, something related to the cultural this thing, and I kept saying Indian subcontinent, because that's what I had learned growing up. That's what I'd read in my textbooks growing up. And then she pointed out, and she's like, it's wrong to say Indian subcontinent, because when you say that, you're putting India at the center, and all the other subcontinental countries are much less powerful. So you're in the power hierarchy, India then sits at the top, and then we're saying that the rest are not as powerful. So the right word to go about is South Asia. And that actually, I was like, really, all my life for the past 27 years, I have been thinking that I've, like, I've been saying this, and I didn't know that it's something so something so major, because it has connotations, again, like who is more powerful and who is not. And that's sort of like the whole idea of how it's important to understand language, and how in little ways it sort of seeps into these biases. It came into being from that conversation, and I think the whole podcast, the whole idea of me like having this interest in language came from that conversation, had a huge impact. So I when you mentioned third world and the developing countries, it actually brought me back to that. And I think this was one of the first things when I spoke to Malene for the first time. This was one of the first things I told her also, that I didn't know, like it was like I didn't know that this could be something that this something, a bias that was, without even knowing that it was a bias, I was holding on to that. I was propagating that in certain ways, because I didn't know the correct usage. So now whenever I meet people, I say this, because I know most of the people I know have been using the same term. So I'm like, it's not Indian subcontinent, it's South Asia. So yeah.
Yeah, it was kind of a perfect transition that you did for Sadia without knowing, because the first season of What's the Word, it is on regions and how we talked about different regions. So Shreya went and talked to different journalists and different experts about different regions. So South Asia, East Asia, Latin America, Africa, and how they're reported on the more general. Because we were looking for the first topic on this, because language is everywhere, so we could talk about basically everything. It was like, let's just start with the beginning. Like, how do we talk about the world and different regions and all of it, and what do we define as regions? And so it was perfect. All right. Well, we're a bit over time, but it's usually a good sign. It means we're having a good conversation. I don't think there are any more questions, but if you do, you know where to find us. You have all of our social media in the comments. If you're on YouTube, and if you're following us on LinkedIn and Twitter X, then you're already on our social media, so you know how to write to us. Thank you so much, Sadia and Shreya, for taking the time of having this very interesting conversation with us. I had a great time. I hope the people who watched did too, and maybe learn a couple of things or question a few things if they didn't, at least. Um, Anything you want to say to conclude this session?
I would say I had a great time, and it was like it was honestly a pleasure meeting Sadia, because I've been interacting with her work for so long. So getting to finally share this platform with her, it's been a privilege, I'd say.
I would say the honour is mine. What you're doing is fantastic, and I am just cheering you along. You're brilliant. So thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. Please go check out Language Matters. It's very informative, and we always love it. It always sparks very interesting conversations in our team. Yeah, we'll see you next month for the next Aidóni's talk. We'll update you on the topics and the guests. And don't forget to look at our Spotify to listen to our very new, very first podcast ever. And the first episode is coming out next Thursday. So stay tuned. It was lovely to see everyone, and let's see you next month. Bye.
Bye.